Well, good morning, everyone. Today I wanted to go through very quickly and discuss issues related to our first exam, our midterm exam for this semester. Just to give you a little bit of information associated with our exam in terms of the number of questions, because I know that some of you may have had that question itself. The exam will be made up of two parts. The exam will be made up of a short answer section and then also of a long answer section. The short answer section, there's nothing to freak out about in terms of how it is to respond to these particular sections. With the short answer section, short answers literally mean short answers. I'm generally looking for a one-word response or a very short phrase in terms of the response associated with that particular question. So there may be a question on the exam for the short answer part that says something to the degree of um, what is the purpose of research, and giving a very brief response in terms of the purpose of research, to move the field forward and to discover new issues. Or there may be a question related to error variance, and it may say define error variance, or I may give you the definition of error variance and you provide me the term. Something very, very brief. You can also use examples as your answer. So if you don't know the answer off the top of your head in terms of the definition or the term itself, you can give an example of what that term refers to, and that definitely works for credit as well. So I do try to be lenient in terms of that. The second section is the long answer section. The long answer section, that's going to be made up of 10 questions. Or like I mentioned, also with the short answer section, we're going to have 20 questions. The long answer section will only have 10 questions. With your 10 questions for your long answer section, very, very brief, bullet pointed responses is what I'm looking for. Here, I'm not looking for paragraphs. I'm not looking for complete sentences or anything like that. I want bullet point information, and generally the answers that correspond to those particular types of questions that I'm going to ask in the long answer section refer to things that you can do in bullet point format. So I may have something like, briefly identify and discuss the three conditions of causality specified by David Hume. And you would point out all three: covariation, internal validity, temporal precedence, and then you would briefly discuss them very briefly. You would say temporal precedence, A comes before B; covariation, a change in A is accompanied by a change in B; internal validity, control all other mechanisms, and only A can be the causal mechanism associated with the change in B. And that's your answer for those particular sections. So again, remember, for your short answer section, 20 questions; for your long answer section, 10 questions. And you do have to complete all 20 short answer and all 10 long answer questions as well. Okay, so in terms of our review, what is our review going to cover, or our exam going to cover? Our exam is going to cover our first four lectures that we've had in the semester. So lecture one was looking over at the introduction of the course to research methods. We talked a lot about what the purpose of research was, what the progression of science is. We talked about the progression of science in a number of different lectures this semester. Again, remember, identifying that the effect even exists, identifying moderators, mediators, and then establishing definitive causality. Also, what's the main purpose of actually doing research? The four purposes: to describe, explain, predict, and control are all the purpose of research. In terms of trying to gain knowledge, very important to understand the differences between our different types of knowledge. Very, very important. In terms of science, what makes scientific disciplines a scientific discipline? Remember, so we use the scientific method. Knowing the characteristics associated with our scientific discipline is also going to be very important. So these 6 characteristics that we have here given to us by Rosenthal and Rosenow. And then also how it is that we actually try to answer questions through rationalism and empiricism, and which we as scientists try to use as the basis for our research purposes. Again, also trying to understand how it is that we conduct research, and remember that we're always trying to conduct research in a logical progression. So today I'm not going to jump in from one specific subdiscipline to another subdiscipline tomorrow, and so on and so forth, but rather I'm always going to stay within that similar subdiscipline. And even if I may collaborate with other individuals from other subdisciplines, I'm the one who brings my expertise to my specific subdiscipline in those specific instances. Also, we talked a lot about how to come up with research ideas and difficulties associated with coming up with research ideas, and that there are these 3 major overarching reasons that we come up, or that we have difficulty coming up with research ideas: because we misunderstand the research process, we have irrational fears associated with the research process, and last, we have irrational anxieties about our own research process as well. We also talked about why it's so important to always establish first our research questions prior to actually deciding on a design. In many instances, people decide on the design prior to knowing what the research question is, and they end up getting hindered in terms of trying to answer the research question that they have in mind because they're so obsessed with wanting to have this specific research design put in place. So, for instance, using a reaction time box or using eye trackers. Why would we ever want to use those if we don't even know what our research question is? We may not even need them for that specific research study. So again, remember, our designs, our paradigms, our tools are only there to help us answer our research questions. So again, always think about in terms of research, who it is that defines you in terms of your research area, and that's what we tend to be comfortable with, and we end up doing most research in based on something that we've kind of already experienced in our lives in the past. And I've given you the example of how it is that I've kind of identified myself in terms of a researcher as well. Again, just remember that we also talked a lot about defining the differences between constructs and operational definitions, and having that leap of faith that our operational definition is actually being captured, or that our construct is being captured by our operational definition. So remember, our construct is something abstract that we're working with, but yet the operational definition specifically defines what that construct is. And that's very, very important for us, because whenever it is that we develop hypotheses, it's going to be very, very important for us to understand that we're creating these predictions based on previous evidence that we assume our construct is being captured on by our operational definition and the tools that we use. We also talked about the differences between independent and dependent variables and why those are so important and how it is that they work within the research realm. The different types of independent variables, we discussed those kinds, and the classes of actual dependent variables as well. Very, very important. We also talked about exogenous and endogenous variables, kind of a new introduction into the way that we discuss independent and dependent variables and the relationship that they may have towards each other and the roles that they may take within our research models. And then last, we talked in lecture 1 about theory and psychology, and about how it is that we are a theory-driven discipline, and how it is that we actually organize theories and what the purposes of those theories actually are. So in terms of theories, remember, these are sets of concepts that explain data and predict future events, and all that that means for us is that we've gathered data from all these empirical resources that have looked at the specific topic, and we put it all together, and it helps us to explain the data that we've collected, and it also sets us up to have future hypotheses to be able to test based on all that data that's been collected in the past. Very, very important for us, and also understanding that there are limits and that there are specific limits to theories, that theories can be qualified and they can also be disproved in specific instances, but we can never prove theories. And the reason that we can never prove theories is because there's never an absolute for us that this will exist in every single instance, but rather we can show that this event may not potentially occur in every single instance, but it may happen in some instances. So again, be very, very careful with using this term prove in these particular instances. We also then last talked about hypotheses and the different types of hypotheses that we use. And again, very, very important, understanding the differences between a research question and a research hypothesis. And again, how hypotheses can be constructed in two different ways, through the construct purpose or through the operational definition purpose. And again, very, very important that we understand the relationship between those. And again, we would select to use the operational definition purpose rather than the construct purpose, because it's much more specific for us, and knowing that that's very, very beneficial for us in those specific instances. All right, so that wraps up kind of our discussion associated with lecture 1. So let's move into talking about lecture 2 and kind of reviewing that information a little bit, and kind of what it is that I would highlight in these specific instances for lecture number 2. Again, I reiterated the purposes of a hypothesis, and again, I'm talking about hypothesis here over and over and over again, so you can imagine that that's going to be very important information for your midterm, because again, it's so important for us to understand what the purpose of a hypothesis is, and also where it is that we derive hypotheses from, and we derive them again from previous literature, and that's very important for us to understand, because if we don't assume that they come from previous literature and that they're just something that we come up with on our own, just this educated guess, that's not going in the right direction for research, but rather we are creating predictions based on previous evidence. Very, very important for us. Again, we also talked about the different types of hypotheses. So we talked about the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis and the role that they take within statistics and research methods. And very important that we test the null and that we test the null hypothesis statistically, and we also have the alternative hypothesis available for us to be able to predict. And in some instances, we may predict the null hypothesis depending on what the literature is telling us in those specific instances. Now, also remember, we're using our research designs there to help us answer our research questions. I can't stress this enough as to what the purpose of a research design is. The purpose of a research design is solely there to help us answer our research question by testing our research hypothesis. They are not the purpose of research. And a lot of people assume that the design, that the paradigm, that the tool itself is the actual purpose of research, that I have to do qualitative data or I have to do quantitative data, when in reality, it definitely does not. We also talked about looking at different types of hypotheses or the different components associated with hypotheses, and we talked about 5 different components. So the nature of the data's measurement, the nature of the study setting, the nature of the variables in its control, and the nature of participation, and also the nature of the study's purpose. Very important 5 characteristics that we look at whenever it is that we're examining and trying to test a hypothesis within a research setting. So remember, with looking at the data measurement, we can either have qualitative versus quantitative data. Here I gave you guys a lot of examples associated with the differences between qualitative and quantitative and the pros and cons to each. Very, very important. I would definitely know these 5 different components associated with hypothesis testing, and especially knowing the differences between qualitative and quantitative data, especially that many of you may be using both types of data collection methods during your careers. We also talked about laboratory and field designs and about when to use them and about how internal and external validity relate to both of these types of issues. So very important to understand their relationship with internal and external validity, and which one has generally higher internal, which one has lower external. Remember that lab has higher internal, lower external. Field has lower internal but has higher external validity, since we're doing it out in the field. We also talked a lot about experimental research designs and what the conclusions are associated with truly experimental research designs. We also talked about the 4 criteria associated with the logistics of experimentation. We talked about what random sampling, what random assignment, were manipulation of an independent variable, and also having internal validity associated with your research study in these particular cases. So remember, the whole purpose of having an experimental research design is for us to be able to draw a causal conclusion. So here the issue related to cause, very, very important for us. But yet in reality, it's going to be very hard for us to be able to establish these 4 criteria. So rather, what is it that we're ending up with? We're generally ending up with non-experimental designs, or which we call correlational designs. So again, it's very, very difficult for us to actually establish a truly experimental design, but if we could, and we did, it would be great, because then we would be able to establish causal conclusions between our variables. We also talked a lot about conditions of causality, and how conditions of causality relate to the issues related to true experimental research designs, and about why they're so important. We talked about these specific 3 conditions. I would definitely know these for the exam, especially since I've already told you that may be a type of question that I may use for something like a long answer question. And then we talked about correlational research designs and about why those are so important for us to use, and how the majority of us fall within that realm of a correlational design, that rather than drawing causal conclusions, we draw relationship conclusions between our variables in this specific instance. We also talked about the nature of the study, the nature of participation. So between groups designs versus within group designs, what are the advantages and disadvantages? I would definitely know the differences between practice effects and carryover effects, and why attrition hinders our within group design participation. Definitely know those particular types of issues. So here, very, very important that we understand those. And last, we also talked about the nature of the study's purpose, the basic purpose versus the applied purpose. And again, we're not necessarily saying that there is one type of research design that is better than another, but rather it's just what is it that you want to do in terms of the purpose of your research study. Do you want to go out and do it in the field? Do you want to go out and try to solve a real world issue that exists? Or do you just want to garner more knowledge associated with our specific topic of interest that is psychological in its nature, and all that you want to do is do research in the lab or even research in the field, but you just want to extend that knowledge through basic research in those specific instances. So again, just kind of depending on what it is that you want to do, you're going to have different purposes in those specific instances. Then we moved into talking about measuring our constructs and about why measuring our constructs is so important. And we talked about different types of variables in these particular instances. We talked about the differences between independent and dependent variables, manipulated versus observed independent variables in these particular cases. And again, remember, your independent variable is not always the one that's manipulated, because you can potentially have an observed independent variable. So again, here, if you're comparing, let's say, males and females in terms of aggression, the independent variable in this particular case is the male and female factor, the gender factor, but yet that's not under your direct control. So it is still the independent variable, but it's just an observed independent variable in that particular instance. Then we also talked about the differences between person and environmental variables and about why those are so important. Again, we talked about exogenous versus endogenous variables. Again, very, very important discussion associated with those, and I would definitely recommend knowing those specific differences for the exam, especially since I've already talked about them multiple times. And we also moved in again to talking about constructs and operational definitions. So here it seems like if I just keep trying to present you with the exact same information over and over again, but I am, because it's very, very important for us to understand this relationship between constructs and operational definitions, because if we don't understand this relationship, it makes it very, very difficult for us to actually be able to do research, because we don't even understand that specific relationship between them. We then moved into talking about reliability and validity, and talking about the issues related to error variance and why error variance is so important for us to try to manage. We talked about this issue of error variance, again looking at the differences between our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control, but rather due to some other potential factor. Let that be individual differences, let that be some compound or third variable or an extraneous variable that we have within our research study. And the idea of us creating a measurement tool, or having some type of paradigm or some type of a design that reduces that error variance is going to be very, very good for us, because what we want to try to do is we want to try to make sure that we always get the same response over and over and over again with reliability. And again, we measure reliability, or we assess reliability through two specific qualities. We assess it through, number one, stability, and stability is tested through retest reliability. So again, taking the scores from time 1, taking the scores from time 2 with no intervention in between, we should be able to look at the relationship between those scores and have a high positive correlation. In other words, scores at time 1 go up, scores at time 2 go up, scores at time 1 go down, scores at time 2 go down. That means that we're going to have a nice positive relationship in that specific instance, meaning that we're probably going to have stability. Our scores are going to be stable across time. If our scores differ drastically and no intervention existed in between, then our measurement is not going to be stable at that point. It's not going to be reliable, and that's going to be problematic for us. So rather, what do we end up with? We end up with a non-reliable measurement in that specific instance. So again, establishing stability is going to be very, very important for us. Then we also talked about consistency and how we measured consistency. Again, we talked about measuring it through split half reliability and also internal consistency. Remember, this is where we talked about split half reliability, splitting up our assessment tool in different forms, and then looking at the relationship between part 1 and part 2, and then trying to see if there's a high positive correlation between those specific sums of our scores. And we also talked about internal consistency, splitting up our our assessment tool in all possible ways, and then looking at all possible split half reliabilities, and then creating an overall average, and that giving us an overall average Cronbach's alpha in that specific instance, or what we also call a coefficient alpha. And the higher the number, the better for us. And again, remember, the maximum or the absolute value that we can have associated with internal validity and also split half reliability are going to be values of 1 in that specific instance, since we use a correlation statistic. We also talked about these 3 statements associated with reliability and validity, and about why these 3 statements are so important for us. With reliability, remember, we're talking about assessing one single construct. If we're not reliable, that means that we're assessing multiple constructs. With validity, we're talking about measuring the right constructs. So reliability does not indicate validity. So in other words, just because you're measuring the same thing over and over again doesn't mean you're measuring the right thing. And that's very important for us to understand, because you totally could be measuring the wrong thing, but hey, you're at least measuring one single thing. thing. A reliable measure may potentially be valid, meaning that you have done the measurement, you are measuring only one single thing, and you might potentially be valid, but there's no guarantee of that. And last, an unreliable measure can never be valid. So in other words, if you're measuring multiple constructs, then you cannot be right in this particular case. And again, we would never want to use that kind of tool in that specific instance. And then last, we talked about how to assess validity through all our five different forms, through phase content validity, convergent concurrent validity, divergent discriminant, predictive validity, and construct validity. And I would definitely take a look at those specific ones and make sure that that we know the differences between those in those specific instances. All right, the last lecture that we talked about, we talked again about internal and external validity and about why those are so important again. With internal and external validity, again, very important for us to look at those specific issues because part of what we want to do is we want to try to understand what the relationship is between internal and external validity and how to manage internal validity and also how to manage external validity. We talked a lot about the research programs and about the research process again, about research being very programmatic in its nature and that logical progression, the progression of science again. We talked a lot about the Einstein syndrome and about why that sometimes hinders people with coming up with research ideas and being able to move on within the research domain because they continue to get caught up with this idea that they have to have major breakthroughs every time they're doing a research study. These are the people that are always going to have plaques on their names on the wall or anything like that. That's no guarantee that's always going to happen to us. But rather, what do we want to do? We want to try to have this gradual synthesis model of research approach where we're doing smaller discoveries every single time and we're moving toward those larger discoveries as a field, not necessarily just as an individual. So again, very important that we understand our role as researchers in the larger scheme of things with the idea associated with doing research, that we're just a smaller part of the whole larger breakthrough in those specific instances, that we're just paving the way for others. And again, understanding what the purposes of our research is and the results of our studies and that they're inherently limited. And this is why, you're always going to get into arguments with people from other disciplines saying, oh, is it really valid, the work that you all do? Because, you guys use just college students and you don't go out into the real world and do this. Well, yeah, there's always going to be limitations to everything that we do because we're testing only specific hypotheses about specific research questions that we have. We have a very limited sample, a very limited context, and a very limited operational definition that we were using, and even the tools and paradigms that we're using are very limited in their own nature. And again, remember, the whole purpose of research is to answer some questions, but it's also going to leave us with many more questions in the future, and we're never going to be overly happy in that specific instance. And again, with the issue related to magic bullets, I think this is one of my favorite areas to always talk about, that there's no one single answer or one single causal mechanism as an explanation to our complex phenomenon of what we call psychological issues. Let those be normal or abnormal issues. Things are very complex for us in psychology, and it's very rarely caused by one single thing, but rather it's multiple variables that produce that effect additively and interactively. So again, always referring back to our specific answer of it depends in those specific instances. And then we talked about the issues related to internal and external validity and what the differences are between the two. Remember, with the idea of internal validity, we're trying to control all possible factors within our research situation, so that way we are only going to be left with what we call effect variance, right? So the differences between our scores that are due to the researcher's manipulation or control. So that way the conclusions that we draw about our research study are going to be valid, and we're going to have much more confidence in terms of our findings and in terms of our results, rather than us saying, oh, well, I'm happy with my results, but it could have also been due to that person screaming outside the door may have potentially been creating the answers for the participants in that specific instance, or it was really hot in the room, it was 100 degrees in the room, and that may have changed the way that the participants reacted, but I'm still fairly confident in my results. Well, no, you're not going to be confident in your results because you have these extraneous factors that exist there, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to limit them in that specific instance. Now, with external validity, what we're trying to do is we're trying to now generalize our results to a larger population. Because again, remember, we're not so much interested in terms of the sample, we're interested in the population as a whole. That's what really matters to us in this specific instance, because we want to get out there to the larger population. And understanding that relationship between both internal and external validity is going to be very important, that they're both going to affect each other. So if you're going to give one up, you're going to have higher in the other. So if you want to give up internal validity and you want to do your research out in the field because you want to generalize to a larger population, go right ahead, but you're going to have lower internal validity, you're going to have less confidence in terms of your results, but you are going to have greater generalizability to your population because you are actually doing the research out in the field. Well, if you don't want to give up internal validity and you want to have much more confidence in your results, you generally tend to have to do research in the lab. So that means you don't actually have a real world situation. Here, you're now decreasing your generalizability of your work, and now that changes drastically how well that applies to your population in terms of the future, right? Very, very important. Again, I presented the issues again related to the progression of science. This is the third time in 4 lectures that I talk about this issue, so as you can imagine, it's probably going to be on the exam. Again, understanding why internal validity is very, very important for us. Again, going back to this issue of having confidence in terms of our results, because what we're trying to do is minimize error variance, those differences in our scores that are not due to the researcher's manipulation or control. I have said the definition of error variance, I think, just in this review session like 3 or 4 times, and I know that during our lectures over the last 4 weeks I probably said it about 1,000 times, so I definitely would think that might also be on the exam. Again, I talked about the conditions of causality, very, very important for us, and we talked a little bit more just about the issues related to internal and external validity and threats to internal validity and also threats to external validity and how it is that we may combat some of these types of issues, and then different types of external validity as well. That really wraps up our discussion associated with our 4 lectures. I just wanted to kind of briefly go through them and highlight some portions that I think are very important. Of course, I went through each one of our slides that we've gone through, so I assume that everything is important, to be honest with you, but there are certain things that I have highlighted and pointed out during the course of today's review session that I think are vastly important, and I definitely recommend for you guys to be able to take a look at those. Again, just as a reminder, our exam will be posted on Friday, tomorrow. I will be posting that up for you guys, and you will have a couple of days look at the due date on Blackboard and also on the exam to make sure that they coincide and that you know specifically when the due date is. Again, remember your exam is going to be made up of 2 parts, the short answer section and the long answer section. Short answer section, brief responses, 1-word response, one very quick incomplete sentence response, I'm good with that, or a very quick example of what it is that you wanted to talk about in terms of the answer. Again, we have 20 questions in terms of the short answer, and for the long answer we have 10 questions, and again, I'm looking for answers that generally tend to have multiple parts to the answer itself. So something like the condition of causality, the progression of science, differences between and within groups, research designs, etc. Here again, I'm not looking for paragraphs, I'm not looking for complete sentences. If you give it to me in bullet point format, I'm going to be good. All right, that's it for our review session, guys, and I hope that you enjoyed it, and I wish you luck on the exam, and please let me know if you have any questions.